long before the highways carved their way through the Appalachian spine. A scattering of families made their living deep in the valleys, isolated by forests so dense the sun itself seemed reluctant to enter. One such family was the Harpers, who built their homestead on a slope of land west of Blackbird Ridge, in what was then Avery County, North Carolina. The Harpers were known as quiet folk, hardworking, God-fearing, and private. Neighbors, few as they were, spoke well of Elias Harper, the patriarch, a man of precise habits who farmed the narrow valley and hunted the ridgeline for pelts and meat. His wife, Clara, was said to have healing hands, midwife, herbalist, and confidant to the mountain women. Together, they raised 2 children, Jonah and Pearl, in a house built of pine and stone beside a spring that never froze. Then, in the spring of 1912, something changed. The journals of Reverend Amos Blackwell, whose small chapel stood 10 miles downriver, record a note of concern. He wrote that Elias Harper had ceased attending Sunday service, that when visited, Elias appeared wan and fearful, as one marked by a heavy secret. It was around that same time, locals said, that the animals began to act strange, dogs howling without reason, cattle refusing to drink from the stream. The air near the ridge grew thick with a sour smell, like metal and wet clay. One evening, Elias told his wife he had found something on the mountain, a clearing he swore hadn't been there before. A ring of stones, blackened as if by fire, set deep into the soil. 3 days later, Elias disappeared. His footprints led halfway up the ridge and stopped at the edge of the clearing. The rifle he carried was found leaning against a tree, and beside it, the ground had been disturbed, as though something large had been unearthed or buried again. By summer, Clara packed what little she could carry and took the children down to her sister's home near Asheville. She spoke little of that night, save for a single phrase that became part of the Harper family's whispered legacy. The mountain takes back what's been taken from it. Over the years, the homestead vanished into the woods, but the ridge remained, a place avoided by hunters and travelers alike. Maps from the 1930s still mark the area with an unusual notation: Harper Hollow, unfit for settlement. And though no one lives there now, some say the land still breathes. In the spring of 1935, more than 2 decades after the Harper family vanished from the records of Avery County, a small team of federal surveyors was dispatched into the western hills. The government was mapping parcels for the new Blue Ridge Parkway, and their orders were simple: mark the ridge lines, measure the soil, and note anything of agricultural value. Among the group was Edgar M. Cole, a quiet man from Raleigh known for his precision. Cole kept detailed notebooks, coordinates, weather, sketches of flora, and it is through his surviving field entries that most of what we know about Harper Hollow endures. April 11th, 1935, reached the ridge west of mile marker 23. Local guide refused to proceed past the pine break, saying, "No man hunts that side." Found signs of old clear and charred posts, stone foundation, spring still running clear. Cole's later notes grew stranger. He described a circular depression on the ridge summit, lined with vitrified stones as if by lightning or long fire, and an odor of iron and decay that lingered even when the wind turned. He collected soil samples that, according to a memo filed weeks later, contained high concentrations of oxidized material inconsistent with surface burning. 2 days after the discovery, one of the laborers on the survey, Thomas Hawley, failed to report for breakfast. Searchers found his compass, torn coat, and pack beside the clearing, but no trace of the man himself. Cole's final written line before abandoning the site read, "The earth here is not stable. It moves at night." The Harper Hollow tract was subsequently struck from the Parkway expansion. Official reasoning cited terrain instability and unexplained subsoil hazards. By 1940, the area was listed on state maps only as Restricted Timber Reserve. Locals, however, revived the old phrase that had haunted the Harper name. The mountain takes back what's been taken. In the autumn of 1962, Dr. Margaret Ellison of the University of North Carolina undertook a cultural survey of oral traditions in the Western Ranges. Her focus was to record the vanishing songs and legends of rural mountain communities before modern life erased them. Ellison's typewritten journals, held today in the UNC Southern History Collection, contain a brief but curious entry under Avery County Blackbird Ridge. September 17, 1962, interviewed Mrs. Bessie Tolliver, age 82, born near Harper Hollow, recalls stories told by her grandmother about the Harpers. Says the family took something from under the mountain, a stone or box, and that the earth never rested right after. Claims her own father heard a deep moaning in the ridge the night Elias Harper disappeared. Several days later, Ellison and her assistant, Frank Delaney, attempted to locate the hollow itself. Her field log notes that the trail vanished in laurel thickets, but they eventually reached a clearing with arranged stones, black glassy at the edges. She collected a single fragment for analysis. Laboratory reports later identified it as silicate fused under extreme heat, though there was no record of lightning strikes or fire in that area for decades. That night, at a boarding house in Banner Elk, Ellison recorded an audio interview with the property owner, Mr. Carver Pritchard. The tape cataloged as Box 14, Reel 3 still survives. Pritchard, on tape, "You shouldn't have gone up there, ma'am. My daddy worked survey crew in the 30s. Said they opened something that ought to have stayed sealed. Every time somebody digs near that ridge, the fog don't lift right for weeks. Animals go missing, folks get touched by dreams." Ellison, "What kind of dreams?" Pritchard, pause, Cheer Creek. "The kind where the ground breathes back at you." 3 days after the interview, Ellison's assistant Delaney filed a brief report stating the professor had fallen ill with fever and vivid nightmares. She abandoned the expedition, returning to Chapel Hill and sealing her notes with a line. "Harper Hollow is not a legend, it is a scar." For decades, the recordings remained forgotten in the university archive, labeled simply Field Notes Incomplete. In 2004, a small team of independent filmmakers from Asheville began work on a limited series documentary about forgotten Appalachian folklore. The project, titled Hollow Voices, sought to explore lost settlements, vanished families, and the truths behind local legends. Producer Caleb Morgan was the first to uncover the story of the Harpers. While researching at the UNC Southern History Collection, he found a mislabeled archive box containing Dr. Margaret Ellison's reels, brittle field notes, and the mysterious phrase scrawled across a folder spine, "Do not transcribe Reel 3. Morgan and his team digitized the audio, releasing a short clip in their teaser trailer. In it, a man's voice believed to be Mr. Pritchard's can be heard whispering through tape hiss, "The ground's still breathing, still hungry." Within days, the production had drawn regional attention. Local residents warned the filmmakers not to stir old dirt, while county officials refused access to the original Harper tract, citing conservation laws. Undeterred, Morgan obtained satellite images that showed a faint circular outline still visible beneath the tree canopy. On October 12th, the crew entered the restricted zone under a research permit. GPS logs and camera footage confirmed they reached what appeared to be the remnants of the Harper Foundation shortly after dusk. The final minutes of recovered audio from camera 2 capture the following. Wind. Caleb Morgan marked the stones in a perfect ring fused black. Same as Ellison's notes. Assistant, ground soft here. You feel that? Like it's sudden distortion, static, unidentified whisper. Takes back. At 1943, the feed cut out. Rescue teams located the van 2 days later at the base of the old service road. Inside were backpacks, a tripod, and Dr. Ellison's original tape rewound neatly to the beginning. No members of the crew were ever found. The unfinished documentary was never released. However, a final line in Morgan's production journal survives. There's a pulse under the soil. You can feel it when the wind dies. Whatever the Harpers unearthed, it's still waiting. The Harrows came into the valley in the summer of 1872, following the old wagon road until the trees closed in so tight that the sun looked like a thin coin lost in fog. There were 5 of them, then Ezekiel Harrow, his wife Ruth, their 3 grown children, and a mule that wouldn't stop trembling. Locals from the nearest town, Laurel Gap, said the Harrows had come from back east somewhere, though no one could name exactly where. Their wagon carried little but tools, a Bible, and a trunk that took 4 men to lift. When they asked why he'd chosen a patch of ground so far from any help, Ezekiel answered only, "The Lord led us here to keep the blood clean." The hollow they settled later, marked on maps as Harrow Ridge, was a cruel stretch of mountain. The soil was thin, the river choked with iron. Trees grew twisted, bark pale as bone. Yet Ezekiel built fast, a longhouse of pine and shale, a smokehouse, pens for hogs. He drove nails with scripture on his lips, and every strike echoed like a sermon. By autumn, hunters from Laurel Gap began hearing strange sounds from the ridge lows singing after dark, voices that rose and fell in odd harmony. Some said it wasn't English at all. Others swore it was a kind of praying, though no preacher they knew ever called God by that many names. In '74, the youngest Harrow boy, Caleb, came down to town for salt and gunpowder. The shopkeeper noted his skin had gone nearly translucent, veins like blue strings beneath. When asked about it, Caleb smiled too wide and said, "The air up there changes a man." After that, the family stopped coming down altogether. Letters sent to them went unanswered. The postwriter who tried to deliver the last parcel returned pale and sweating. He told the sheriff the valley smelled wrong like wet stone and something spoiled under it. That winter, the snow on Harrow Ridge never melted. Even in March, when crocus bloomed in Laurel Gap, the ridge stayed white as a shroud. At night, townsfolk claimed they saw a faint red light flicker in the trees, pulsing like a heartbeat. By the time a group of settlers tried to check on them in 1876, the homestead looked abandoned. The door hung open, tools rusted to the walls. In the cellar, they found a series of shallow pits freshly turned, as if someone had been trying to bury small things and change their mind. What remained of the family was harder to explain. 3 wooden chairs stood before the hearth, each holding a bundle wrapped in cloth, knotted neat at the throat like children's nightcaps. When one of the men loosened a knot, a hand slipped out, small, pale, perfectly preserved. The sheriff ordered the cellar sealed and the property condemned. But Ezekiel Harrow's body was never found. For years afterward, hunters reported hearing hammering deep in the fog, as if someone were still building a house underground. And in every census after 1880, one name kept appearing on the county rolls, written in the same tight handwriting: Ezekiel Harrow, head of household. By the mid-1890s, Laurel Gap had almost forgotten the Harrows. The ridge above the town was overgrown. Storms had taken most of the trail. Yet every so often, smoke was seen rising where no chimney should still stand. Hunters swore they heard axes at work after dark. Then, in the spring of '95, a girl named Nora Hobbs came down from the mountains barefoot and half-starved. When she finally spoke, she said she'd been born in the hollow. Her speech was slow, as if she were teaching herself the shape of words. The doctor who examined her noted that her eyes were oddly pale, her pupils narrow like a cat's. She claimed her family lived in the old place, and that there were more of us than Papa can count. When asked her father's name, she said simply, Ezekiel. The town wanted to believe she meant a descendant, but the dates didn't fit. By every measure, the original Ezekiel Harrow would have been dead more than 20 years. Nora disappeared from the infirmary the following night. The nurse swore she heard a man's voice outside the window calling softly, "Come back to the blood." They searched the next morning and found only prints in the mud barefoot, both large and small leading north toward the ridge. For months afterward, livestock around Laurel Gap were found mutilated but uneaten. Farmers said the carcasses were arranged in circles, as though part of some grim counting. The sheriff organized a posse to ride up the hollow, but none of the men could get their horses to cross the tree line. One animal reared so violently it broke its own leg. The following winter was the coldest in memory. Streams froze solid. The mountain winds carried what folks called the hum deep, low vibration that made doors tremble and windows buzz. Children woke screaming, saying they dreamed of a house without walls, where voices whispered from the earth itself. By 1897, the county stopped recording births or deaths for anyone claiming kin to the Harrows. The name became a curse. And still, at census time, the same entry appeared. Ezekiel Harrow, head of household. No one knew who filled out the form. The handwriting never changed. When the missionary circuit sent Reverend Silas Baird into the Blue Ridge in the spring of 1910, his letters spoke of a hollow where no church bell ever rang. He was a small, stern man, proud of his calling and unshaken by mountain superstition. The county clerk had asked him to travel north of Laurel Gap and bring the Harrow people back into the fold, if any of them still lived. April 12, 1910, from the Reverend's journal. Reached the ridge after 2 days' climb. The air here is close and carries the taste of metal. Trees lean toward one another like gossipers. Found the remnants of a fence and a gate that opened itself when I touched it. No birdsong, no smoke. He described finding a house half buried in vines, its timbers blackened but whole. From inside came a faint humming, steady as breath. He wrote that he called out scripture through the doorway. No answer, and stepped inside. Later entry. A table laid for 7, though I count only 4 chairs. A cradle beside the fire, rocking though the air is still. There are marks on the floor circles cut deep with a knife. I feel I've interrupted a prayer meant for something older than God. He claimed to see shapes moving behind the walls, as if the boards themselves were shifting. Then the humming changed pitch and became a voice. "Preacher man, why do you speak a name that is not ours?" The next entry breaks into scrawl, ink smeared by sweat or trembling hand. Only fragments are legible, light behind the hearth. Faces in the clay, the blood remembers itself. The last line, written sideways in the margin. He never died. He divided. The horse that carried Baird's belongings returned to town 3 days later without its rider, eyes wild, reins torn. Searchers found the Reverend's Bible half buried near the Harrow spring. Every page was blank except for the inside cover, where new words had been etched into the leather. Ezekiel Harrow had a household. After that, the circuit closed the mountain parish. Locals stopped saying the Harrow name aloud, claiming it stirs the ground. By the time the federal relief crews reached Harrow Ridge in the winter of 1934, the place had already slipped off most maps. The Works Progress Administration had sent men into the hills to cut a fire road and log whatever timber remained fit for sale. What they found was less a forest than a graveyard of trees, trunks blanched and twisted, roots knotted together like fists. The foreman, Clarence Miller, kept a small ledger for payroll and mother notes. It survives in the county archive, brittle and water-stained. Between his neat columns of numbers are 3 entries that don't belong to any business record. November 29th, set camp near Old Foundation. Found brick chimney still standing, no house attached. Deck 1. Men won't sleep through the night. Something moving underground like thunder. They say it's just frost heave, smells of iron. Deck 4. We dug into the cellar. Floor was too even, like poured clay. There were impressions of hands, hundreds, all pressed upward. On the 5th day, a freezing rain drove the crew to abandon the site. When they returned in spring, the camp was gone. Tents, tools, even the heavy grater. The only sign of human work was a new wooden sign nailed to the last standing pine. The lettering looked burned rather than carved. Property of Harrow. Federal authorities filed the loss as an act of God and sealed the ridge as unstable terrain. In later years, hunters claimed the place never stayed quiet. Earth that twitched, trees that bled sapped the color of rust. An old logger, dying of silicosis in the 1950s, told a nurse that every time his pick struck rock up there, he heard a hollow echo, like hitting a coffin full of wind. No one went back after that. The fire road was reclaimed by the woods, and Harrow Ridge disappeared again beneath moss and memory.